Ava stood at the edge of her small wooden porch. The horizon stretched wide and golden beneath the dying sun. Dust swirled in the thin breeze, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of sagebrush and the dry rustle of prairie grass. Her hands rested on the worn railing, knuckles pale from a grip, fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of days that had grown long and silent. At 23, she had learned to move through the world quietly, folding her grief into the rhythm of her daily chores, yet the loneliness clung to her like an old shawl she could not remove. The cabin behind her was modest, a testament to survival more than comfort, its walls lined with memories too heavy to name aloud. A widowed life, brief and brittle, had left her both wary and tender, a contradiction she carried with an almost delicate pride. The creak of wheels on a distant trail drew her gaze. At first, she thought it might be the wind or some wandering animal, but the sound resolved into the steady clatter of hooves. A man rode into view, his silhouette dark against the amber horizon. He moved with a measured confidence, the kind that suggested experience and an understanding of solitude. His horse's coat gleamed faintly in the last rays of sunlight, and the leather of his saddle whispered stories of miles traveled and nights spent under open skies. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a lean strength that spoke not of brute force, but of endurance. Ethan. Though she did not yet know his name, the quiet weight of his presence stirred something within her, a mix of curiosity and caution. He dismounted slowly, hat in hand, dust falling from the brim as he looked toward her cabin. His eyes, a shade of blue deeper than the prairie sky at dawn, met hers briefly. There was a softness there, an understanding of boundaries, yet an unspoken invitation to trust. Ava stepped down from her porch, heart thrumming against ribs that had grown accustomed to silence. Words were unnecessary at first. The air itself seemed to hum with expectation. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, like water edging over stone. "You'll be safe here for the night," she said, though the words trembled under the weight of unspoken questions. The man nodded once, a simple gesture, but it carried a gravity that filled the spaces between them with quiet respect. His name was Ethan, 24 hours ago unknown, now a presence she would not easily dismiss. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than the prairie outside, the hearth glowing faintly against the creeping chill. Ava moved with purpose, yet each step was measured, wary, as though her small home could be breached not by strangers, but by the fragility of trust itself. Ethan observed quietly, not intruding, not offering advice, merely noticing the small details, the way her fingers brushed over the wooden countertop, the way her eyes lingered on a photograph framed above the mantel. A man she had once loved, now gone, his memory etched in every corner of the room. Ava did not speak of him aloud, yet the weight of his absence hovered in her gestures, in the careful cadence of her movements. Ethan acknowledged this silence with a quiet dignity, never pressing, never forcing, his understanding unspoken but profound. As night settled over the prairie, the wind carrying the faint cry of a distant coyote, the two moved through the cabin together, a careful choreography of shared space. Ava prepared a meal, simple but sustaining, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter beneath her ribs. Ethan assisted only when needed, passing utensils, fetching water, never overstepping. Their interactions were unhurried. The intimacy built not on hurried words or fleeting touches, but on the slow acknowledgement of presence. Every glance, every slight nod, every careful movement wove an invisible thread between them, one that neither yet named but both felt. The cabin, filled with the soft clink of dishes and the low hum of wind against wood, became a sanctuary not only from the prairie night, but from the solitude they each carried in differing ways. In the quiet moments, when the meal was eaten and the fire flickered low, conversation began to unfold. Ava spoke first of practical matters, weather, crops, the care of her small homestead, but gradually, her words wove through the fabric of her own life. She spoke of the man she had loved, the brief years of marriage that had ended with his sudden absence, and the courage required to face each day alone. Ethan listened, his expression unreadable, yet each tilt of his head, each slow nod, communicated a deep empathy. He shared fragments of his own story, years on the road, work that took him from town to town, the sense of always moving yet never arriving. But always he spoke sparingly, letting silence settle like dust in sunbeams between their words. Each confession, each quiet revelation, brought them closer, stitching the beginnings of trust where once only wariness had dwelled. The night deepened, and a storm whispered on the horizon. Clouds gathered like dark thoughts, rolling slowly across the stars, and a chill crept through the cracks of the cabin walls. Ava paused in her movements, a shadow of anxiety passing over her face. She had weathered many storms in her life, yet there was something in the impending tempest that made her chest tighten. Ethan noticed immediately, his gaze steady, calm. He moved with deliberate quiet, securing shutters, checking doors, but never in a manner that suggested dominance. Instead, it was care, steady, unintrusive, a proof of his reliability, without a word. The storm raged outside, fierce and unrelenting, but within the cabin, a fragile warmth persisted, born not of the fire alone, but of shared presence and mutual regard. When the storm passed, the first tendrils of dawn lit the sky, a gentle promise of light after darkness. Ava sat on the cabin steps, her hands clasped over knees drawn close, her hair tangled from restless sleep. Ethan joined her, neither speaking at first, their silence filled with the intimacy of endured night and survived vulnerability. Finally, he turned toward her, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing gently into the morning air. His voice was low, deliberate, carrying the cadence of someone who had seen much yet reserved judgment. He told her, simply, that he had never intended to stay only a night, that in her courage, her softness, and the quiet strength of her spirit, he had found something rare, something worth remaining for. His confession was not grandiose, not desperate, but calm and unshakable, as certain as the rising sun. Ava's heart, long shielded by grief and caution, trembled under the force of revelation. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden, as she absorbed the depth of what he offered. Here was a man who saw her not as broken but brave, not as a widow needing pity, but as a soul deserving of quiet devotion. She felt an emotion she had thought impossible, relief and hope entwined with the stirring of a tentative love, one that had been growing unrecognized in small glances, shared silences, and the gentle consistency of care. Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. The air between them held the weight of all that had passed and all that was yet to come. She simply let herself be, her tears falling freely, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a heart rediscovering trust. The sun climbed higher, gilding the prairie with light that felt almost sacred. Ethan's hand reached for hers, slow and respectful, fingers intertwining without urgency. The touch spoke volumes, a gentle affirmation of presence, of understanding, of a future imagined quietly but vividly. Ava met his gaze, seeing there not just a companion, but a mirror to her own resilience, a witness to her sorrow, and a promise of tenderness yet to unfold. The cabin, once merely a shelter, had transformed into a crucible for healing, the walls echoing with laughter yet unsaid, with shared fear overcome, with a love whispered in glances rather than declarations. In that moment, the story of a lonely widow became the story of a heart reopening, cautious but unbroken. Ethan rose then, gesturing toward the expanse of prairie stretching beyond the cabin. Ava followed, her steps tentative but steady, each one a small triumph over fear. They walked side by side into the morning, dust rising gently beneath their feet, the horizon wide and full of possibility. There was no hurry, no dramatic rush to claim the future, just the quiet certainty that the day had begun differently, that life, in its unpredictable way, had offered them a second chance. The prairie wind tousled their hair, the light shimmered on their shoulders, and in the shared silence, both felt the profound joy of being seen truly, for the first time in years. The narrator's voice, like a whisper through old pages of a diary, lingered over the scene. Sometimes love arrives unannounced, at a door already closed to the world. Sometimes it waits patiently in the quiet corners of life, in small gestures, in shared silences, until hearts, ready or not, recognize its presence. Ava and Ethan stood together, not in the blaze of grand declarations, but in the quiet glow of mutual understanding, a bond forged in patience, respect, and the courage to hope again. The audience felt it too, the slow bloom of trust, the thrill of emotional honesty, the beauty of hearts opening without pretense. As the wind carried the scent of sage and the faint cry of a distant coyote, the story concluded its first chapter not with clamor, but with clarity. A lonely widow had opened her door to a stranger, not knowing he would stay forever. Yet in that choice, made with quiet courage, both discovered the beginning of something profound. And the world beyond the cabin, vast and untamed, seemed suddenly less lonely, touched by the promise of human connection, of love that heals, of hearts brave enough to open once more. The tale whispered to the audience then, soft as the wind through the prairie grass, to reflect on the quiet bonds in their own lives, to remember that courage is often gentle, and that sometimes the most profound stories unfold not in grand gestures, but in the small, steadfast acts of presence, care, and understanding.